My mother looked me dead in the eye at my sister's engagement party and said, "You should probably find something nice to wear. Something that doesn't embarrass us." Then she turned to my sister and said, "Isn't she lovely? Our Courtney marrying into the Ashford name." She didn't even glance back at me. I was standing right there in my Army combat uniform. I had driven 4 hours straight from Fort Campbell, still in my ACUs because I hadn't had time to change. I was a captain. I had 2 tours behind me, one in Afghanistan, one in Kuwait. I had a combat action badge and a chest full of ribbons that most people in that room couldn't name. And my mother looked at me like I was something she'd tracked in on her shoe. That was 8 months before the day that changed everything. Before the morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and a news alert with my brother-in-law's name in the headline. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Leigh. I grew up in a 2-story colonial in Naperville, Illinois. The kind of suburb where the lawns are perfectly edged and the neighbors wave from their driveways and everyone knows, without anyone saying it out loud, exactly where you rank. My mother had a very clear system for ranking. My sister Courtney had always sat at the top of it. Courtney was the one who got the new car at 16. I got driving lessons in my father's old Civic. Courtney was the one who had her college application essay proofread by a tutor my parents paid $400 an hour. I was told to do my best. Courtney graduated from Northwestern with a communications degree and went to work at a PR firm in the Loop and wore blazers to brunch and said things like personal branding in regular conversation. I enlisted in the Army at 19 because I didn't know what else I wanted, and I had found, somewhat to my surprise, that I was very good at structure, at discipline, at the particular kind of quiet that comes from knowing exactly what is expected of you and meeting it. My mother never quite forgave me for it. "It's not that I'm not proud," she told me once at Christmas when I was home on leave and she'd had 2 glasses of Pinot Grigio. "It's just, I pictured something different for you, something more." She waved her hand vaguely. I never asked what more looked like. I didn't need to. I knew. It looked like Courtney. My father had been different. He passed when I was 23, partway through my first deployment. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal, and I didn't make it back in time. That's the thing nobody tells you about serving. You miss things. You miss birthdays and holidays and funerals, and the last good years with people you love, and there's no making it up afterward. There's just the absence, solid as a wall, and you learn to stand next to it without leaning. After he died, my mother sort of recalibrated around Courtney entirely. Like she needed something to orbit. And Courtney, to her credit, let her. They were close in a way that I wasn't equipped to be close. Lunches and shopping and long phone calls. And I had accepted a long time ago that I was the daughter who came home for Thanksgiving and left feeling vaguely like a guest. My husband, Miles, understood this without me ever having to explain it. Miles was a firefighter with the Chicago Fire Department, Truck Company 17, out of Bridgeport. He was steady in the way that firefighters tend to be, not because they don't feel things, but because they've learned to feel things later, after the job is done. He had dark circles he never complained about, and a laugh that came from somewhere low in his chest, and he made the best breakfast burritos I have ever eaten in my life. We met at a 4th of July cookout 6 years ago, introduced by a mutual friend from my ROTC days. We were married 18 months later at the county courthouse with 12 people present, and my mother sent a card. Courtney met Brandon Ashford at a charity gala in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. His family ran Ashford Capital, a private equity firm with an 8-figure portfolio and offices in Chicago, New York, and London. He was 38, recently divorced, no children. He wore custom suits and smiled like a man who had never stood in a line. Courtney brought him to Easter dinner 6 weeks after they met, and my mother spent the entire meal leaning toward him like a plant toward a window. I noticed things about Brandon that I didn't say out loud. The way he answered questions without actually answering them. The way he made eye contact with everyone in the room except the people asking questions of him. The way he referred to his ex-wife as unstable within the first 30 minutes of meeting us, as if that were a normal and appropriate thing to say. I'd spent years reading people in environments where misreading someone could cost you. I had an instinct about Brandon Ashford that I kept folded up and tucked away, because it wasn't my relationship, and it wasn't my family's money, and Courtney was a grown woman who made her own choices. The engagement was announced in December. The Naperville Sun ran a social item. My mother framed it. The wedding was planned for the following September, at a private estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, the kind of venue that doesn't list prices on their website. Brandon's family was paying for most of it, which I think was part of why my mother was willing to overlook certain things. The guest list was 300 people. There was a tasting menu and a string quartet and a fireworks display coordinated with the local fire department, which Miles found both professionally fascinating and personally ironic. I was not invited to be a bridesmaid. Courtney had 6 of them, college friends, PR colleagues, a cousin from my mother's side who I had met twice. I was invited as a guest. My mother, when I mentioned this quietly to her on the phone, said, Leigh, you know how it is, you're always somewhere. It's hard to plan around you. I was stationed at Fort Bragg by then. I had taken leave for the wedding. I had bought a dress, a navy wrap dress from J. Crew, nothing fancy but clean and appropriate and chosen with care. Miles had a suit. We made the 3-hour drive up from Chicago, where we'd been staying with his cousin, on a Saturday morning in September. We were 20 minutes from the venue when my mother called. I need to talk to you about something, she said. Her voice had that particular flatness that meant she had rehearsed. I put her on speaker. Miles glanced at me. What's going on, Mom? I spoke with Courtney this morning, and with Brandon's mother, and I think, given everything, it would be better if you and Miles sat this one out. I didn't say anything for a moment. The highway hummed under us. Sat it out, I said. It's a formal event, Leigh. Black tie. There are going to be photographers, society people, people who matter to Brandon's business. And I think it would be easier for Mom. My voice came out very quiet. Are you telling me not to come to my sister's wedding? I'm asking you to be considerate. You know how things are. You've never really. She paused. You've never really fit in these kinds of settings. And Miles, bless him, he's a wonderful man, but I ended the call. Miles didn't say anything. He signaled and took the next exit, pulled into a gas station parking lot, and put the car in park. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel. Tell me what you want to do, he said. And that's the thing about Miles. He didn't tell me I was right. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't say what he would do, or what I should do, or start the speech about rising above. He just asked what I wanted. 17 years in the fire service, and he still understood that sometimes a person needs to be asked the question before they know the answer. I thought about my father. I thought about the way he used to call me Sarge, even when I was small, before I was anything, before I'd proven anything, like he already knew. I thought about the fact that I had spent 24 hours of the last 72 in transit to be there, and that I had ironed that J. Crew dress on the floor of my cousin's guest room because there was no ironing board, and that somewhere inside the thing I was feeling was not just hurt, but something sharper, something like grief for a version of my family that had never quite existed. I don't want to go, I said, and I don't want to make a scene. I want to go back to the city and get a good meal somewhere and not think about it for the rest of the day. Miles nodded once. He put the car in reverse. We had dinner at a place in Wicker Park, pasta, a bottle of Chianti, tiramisu. Miles made me laugh twice. We didn't talk about the wedding. We drove back to his cousin's place and I lay awake for an hour in the dark, and in the morning I felt something that wasn't okay, but was at least quiet. What I found out later, from Courtney herself, was that my mother had told her I decided not to come. That I had something come up with work. Courtney had believed it, because Courtney had always believed that my life was a sequence of inconvenient deployments that took precedence over being present. She didn't know that I had driven up there in a dress. She didn't know until much later. What I also found out later was why my mother had been so particularly motivated to keep Miles and me out of the room. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother had gone to my father's old financial advisor. My father had left a modest estate, not wealthy, but careful. A paid-off house, some savings bonds, a small brokerage account. The estate had been settled years ago, split between my mother and Courtney and me per the will. What my mother had done, quietly, was withdraw $60,000 from an account that still held my portion of an inheritance I hadn't yet claimed. Money my father had specifically designated for me, managed separately on my behalf while I was deployed, and then simply never transferred because my mother had told the advisor I was difficult to reach and she would handle it. She had used that money as part of Courtney's down payment on a condo purchased the year before. A condo that Brandon had subsequently put his name on as a cosigner. I didn't know any of this yet, not on the day of the wedding, not for another 4 months. What I knew in those 4 months was that Miles and I went back to our life. We live in a bungalow in the Beverly neighborhood on the south side, close to his firehouse, close enough to the interstate for my commute. The street has big oak trees and a block association and a neighbor named Glenn who grows tomatoes every summer and leaves bags of them on people's porches. It is genuinely the life I would have chosen. I want to make that clear, because what comes next is not the story of a woman who is bitter about the life she had. I loved my life. I was just very tired of being made to feel like I should apologize for it. I was promoted to major in January. Miles made lieutenant in February. We celebrated both with a bottle of Maker's Mark and the steaks he grills on the back porch, which is the best meal format either of us can conceive of. My mother called when she heard about the promotion. She said she was proud of me, and I believed she meant it, in her way, and I said thank you, and we talked for 11 minutes, and I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment, and felt the familiar sensation of a door not quite closing. Then March happened. I was at work, at the base, in a planning meeting when my phone buzzed with a news alert. I dismissed it buzzed again, and again. I excused myself and looked at it. The headline was from the Chicago Tribune. Asford Capital Principal, arrest in federal fraud probe. Investors allege scam spanning 6 years. Below it, a photograph of Brandon Ashford being walked out of his Michigan Avenue office building by two men in dark suits and two uniformed federal agents. His face was arranged in what I recognized as a performance of composure. He'd had practice arranging his face. My phone was ringing. It was Courtney. I stepped outside into the pale March light and answered. She was crying in the way that people cry when they haven't slept. "Leigh," she said. "Leigh, I don't. They came this morning. They came to the house. They had a warrant. They took his computers and the files and Leigh, I don't know what's happening." "I know," I said. "I just saw. He always told me everything was fine. He said the business was fine," he said. She stopped. There was a sound like she was pressing her hand over her mouth. "Mom keeps calling, but I can't talk to her right now. I can't do this." "Okay," I said. "I'm going to find out what I can. Don't talk to anyone from the press. Don't post anything. Don't answer any calls from numbers you don't recognize." "Okay," she said. "Okay. Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm at the condo, our condo. But it has his name on it and I'm fine for now," I said. "That's a civil matter. The federal agents are there for him, not for you. Stay put and don't answer the door unless it's someone you know." I spent the rest of the day making calls to people I knew who knew things. A former JAG colleague who now worked in private practice. A friend from Fort Bragg whose brother was an AUSA in the Northern District of Illinois. The picture that assembled itself, piece by piece over the following days, was not entirely surprising and was also somehow worse than I had expected. Brandon Ashford had been running what federal prosecutors were calling a leveraged misrepresentation scheme, which is a formal way of saying he had been taking money from investors under false pretenses, commingling funds, and using new investor capital to pay returns to earlier investors. Not quite a Ponzi scheme in the classic sense, but in the neighborhood. The SEC had been watching for 14 months. The U.S. Attorney's Office had convened a grand jury in January. The morning of his arrest, federal agents had simultaneously executed warrants at his office, his Lincoln Park apartment, and 3 storage units registered to shell companies with his fingerprints on them. Courtney had not known. I believe this. She is not a sophisticated financial person, and Brandon had been deliberately opaque about the business, as people running these kinds of operations tend to be with the people closest to them. She was a victim in the legal sense, and also in the human sense, and I felt for her in the uncomplicated way that you feel for a sibling, even when the relationship is complicated. My mother was a different case. Because here is what came out. In the weeks that followed, when Courtney hired an attorney and began going through her own financial records to establish what she had known, and when my mother had been talking to Brandon's business manager, not casually, regularly, for almost 2 years. She had invested $40,000 of her own money in Ashford Capital, money she had received from my father's estate, based on assurances Brandon had made privately, assurances that were part of the pattern of misrepresentation. She had been receiving quarterly statements that were fabricated. She had known the returns looked too good and had chosen not to examine why. And when the investigators began pulling communication records, they found emails, 17 of them, between my mother and Brandon's business manager, in which my mother had asked pointed questions about exposure and been reassured with numbers that did not correspond to reality. She was not charged. The investigators determined she was a victim, not a co-conspirator. But the emails also showed something else. That she had known, for at least 8 months before the wedding, that questions were being raised internally about the fund's structure, that she had chosen to say nothing to Courtney. That she had, in fact, pushed hard for the wedding to happen quickly. Before things get complicated, she had written in one email a phrase that federal investigators had highlighted in their filings. She had pushed Courtney toward a fraudulent man because she wanted to be connected to his money. And she had pushed me away from that wedding because she was afraid I would see something she needed no one to see. I thought about that for a long time. About how well she had read me and how little she had credited me. She'd known, somewhere in the part of herself she didn't examine, that I would notice. That I would ask the wrong questions at the wrong moment. That I had spent years learning to look at people carefully. She'd kept me out of that room to protect herself, and she'd done it by making me feel small enough that I wouldn't fight to get back in. I did not call her when the news broke. I did not reach out when her name appeared in the Tribune's follow-up coverage, mentioned briefly as an investor who had received fraudulent materials. I let the silence sit. She called me 6 weeks later. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 40 seconds long. She said she had made mistakes. She said she hoped I could understand. She said she missed me. She said that family was family, and that whatever happened, she hoped we could find our way back to each other. I listened to it twice. Then I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table and thought about what my father would say. He would say that the hardest thing about love is that it doesn't require the other person to deserve it. He said that to me once, about someone in his own life, a brother he'd lost touch with, a story I never got the full version of. He said that you could love someone and still refuse to let them keep hurting you, and that those two things could be true at the same time without either one canceling the other out. I thought about the $60,000. My attorney had sent a formal letter to my mother's attorney 2 weeks earlier. She had not yet responded. I thought about what it would cost to pursue it, not just in money but in everything else. In time and attention and the particular kind of energy that legal disputes consume. I thought about my sister. Courtney had moved out of the condo and was renting a 2-bedroom in Evanston. She was cooperating with federal prosecutors. She had called me 8 times since March and I had answered every one of them, and in those conversations something had shifted between us. Not fixed, not healed, but different, more honest. She had told me, on a Thursday evening in April, that she'd found out I had driven up to the wedding, that I'd been in that parking lot 20 minutes away. She'd gone quiet for a long time after I confirmed it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," I said. "I didn't know she'd called you. I really thought you—" "I know, Court." Another silence, then, "She's always done this. Made the version of you that was most convenient for her and then acted like that was the real you." "Yeah," I said. "She really has." I called my mother back on a Sunday afternoon in May. Miles was out in the garden. I sat on the back steps with my coffee and I dialed. She picked up on the second ring, and the relief in her voice was so immediate and so naked that I felt something close to pity. "Leigh," she said. "Hi, Mom. We talked for 43 minutes. Not about the money, that was still with the attorneys. Not about the wedding, not about Brandon. We talked about the tomatoes Glenn had already started in his greenhouse, which she had no way of knowing about, and which I mentioned because I needed something mundane to hold on to. We talked about a TV show she'd been watching. We talked about my father briefly, in the careful way we do when we allow ourselves to, and she cried a little and I didn't. At the end of the call she said, "I know I owe you more than a phone call." "You do," I said. "I'm trying to figure out how to be better." "I know. Do you think?" She stopped. Started again. "Do you think we can get there, eventually?" I looked out at the yard. Miles had come around the corner of the house with his gardening gloves on and a look on his face that meant Glenn had given him tomato advice again. He raised his eyebrows at me. I held up one finger. "I think we can try," I said. "That's all I've got right now. We can try." She said that was enough. I don't know if it is. I'm not sure I do either. Brandon Ashford pled guilty in October to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of securities fraud. He was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. His attorneys negotiated a restitution order for just over $4 million distributed among the investors. Not enough, not close to enough, but something. Courtney received a small portion. My mother received nothing, because the investigators determined her position as a knowing but not acting investor disqualified her from the Victim Restitution Fund. Her attorney was still working on an appeal of that determination when I last checked. The condo sold at a loss. Courtney is renting. She got a new job at a nonprofit, communications director, half the salary of her old PR firm, and she seems, for the first time in a long time, like she's actually somewhere she chose instead of somewhere she landed. The $60,000 from my father's estate was resolved quietly, out of court, 4 months after my attorney's first letter. My mother signed a repayment agreement. She is paying it back in installments. This is not justice exactly, but it is something I can live with, and at this stage of my life I have stopped needing things to be exact. Miles made me breakfast on the morning the repayment agreement was signed. Eggs, sausage, the kind of toast that's slightly too dark the way I like it. He put the plate in front of me and sat down across the table and picked up his coffee and just looked at me for a second. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I think so, because you don't have to be good if you're not." "I know," I said, "but I actually think I am." He nodded. Outside it was November and the oak trees on our street had gone bare, and the sky was that flat gray that means winter is settling in for real. Glenn's tomato plants were long gone, was quiet. The house was warm. There's a version of this story where I tell you that I cut my mother off completely, that I walked away clean and never looked back, and that the closing of that door was its own kind of freedom. I've heard that version from other people, and I believe it's true for them. But it's not my version. My version is messier and slower, and doesn't have a clean moral at the end. My version is Sunday phone calls that are sometimes okay and sometimes hard and always careful. It's a sister I'm rebuilding something with, brick by careful brick. It's a marriage that was never in question, to a man who asked me what I wanted in a gas station parking lot in Lake Geneva and meant it. What I know now that I couldn't have told you before all of this, being underestimated is not just an insult, it's information. My mother spent 30 years telling me, in 100 small ways, what she thought I was worth, and in doing so, she told me exactly what she was working with. She needed me small because small people don't ask hard questions. Small people don't notice things. Small people don't drive 4 hours in their work clothes just to stand in a parking lot and choose dignity over a scene. I am not small, I never was. That's the thing she got wrong, and it's the thing I don't need her to correct. I've already corrected it myself.